Good morning, everyone. How are y'all doing today? Good. Well, we're going to move on to Chapter 7 here, Unit 2. We talked Monday about structure of plants. Try to simplify that a little bit. And we're going to move on to plant growth and development. And we're going to split this up into 2 lectures. So we've got Part 1, edited PowerPoint up there on Blackboard, and Part 2 will shortly be on its way. Couple of reminders. We got the soils lab is due today. I've only got it from a few people, so it really doesn't take a whole lot of time to do that. The one part that does take considerable amount of time is the jar test, the second part of the lab. So I believe that you should be able to still turn that in even after today. It will be marked as late. If you guys have any problems with turning that in, just let me know. And I'll open it back up, do whatever I need to do on my end. Of course, since it's late, you'll have a little bit of a point reduction on that, FYI. Also, the test, of course, is due on Friday. And I've got a couple of those finished, and so far so good. Again, if you have any issues before you start the test, any questions, just let me know. Or if you have any problems once you do start the test.
With that test, do I need to set up a proctored one with a password, or can I take it?
You do not, Megan. You'll just need to log on to Blackboard, and it's on Blackboard. It's still open book, open notes. When we get to exam time, that's when we'll start doing the proctoring.
Okay.
So more on that when we reach the midterm. All right, well, let's get into plant growth and development. Move over to this PowerPoint here. All right, so Part 1, Chapter 7. Hope you guys are reading along in the book. Again, the book does expand on many of these topics. And it's pretty lengthy in the book. Both 6 and 7 are pretty lengthy chapters. Feel free to kind of skip over some parts of Chapter 6. Chapter 7, though, I think is pretty important. The growth and development of plants, because that's what we're really looking at in a lot of cases in crop production. So one of the things that we're going to talk about early on is kind of the difference between growth and development. We look at growth as being kind of a measurable product of kind of living cells, the actual division of those cells, the increase in both the weight and size of the plant, and a definition here. Size increase through cell division and enlargement, including the synthesis of new cellular material and organization of subcellular organelles. Development, though, is different because it happens in stages. And we can kind of look at that and sort of landmark stages for each part of a plant's development. Begins, of course, we think of the seed germination, and that's a whole stage in itself. But it kind of ends with the emergence of the plant itself in the beginning of the growth of the very first vegetative organs and tissues. And then it grows, right? And kind of really the seed germination and the growth, that's sort of separated into 2 stages. As the plant begins to grow vegetatively, it will at some point begin to switch over and initiate and then mature to where it can actually produce its reproductive organs and tissues. It's often flowers and seeds. Before we can actually produce seeds, though, we have to have fertilization, then seed development, and finally maturation of the plant, and finally senescence and death of the plant. And we can see here in this photograph, looking at a poinsettia, on the right we have more growth, on the left we have more development. Got any poinsettia growers out there? Anybody ever work with poinsettias?
We did a lot of it in my high school. Our horticulture and FFA, we did a lot of poinsettias.
Yeah, so as you know then, Megan, there's kind of some interesting things about poinsettias. You have to really watch out for photoperiod. The amount of light or the period of light and darkness, which triggers the developmental stages of the plant. So on the right, this one probably didn't have any of that developmental, photoperiod initiation, whereas on the left, we're actually seeing the initiation of the floral bracts as a response to development of the plant, the development of reproductive organs and tissues. Kind of interesting. I like poinsettias because we don't really have, we think about the flowers, but really the colorful part is actually the flower and leaf bracts, not the actual flower itself. The flower itself is not really showy at all. Talking about how plants grow, they divide, right? We have cell division, and then along with cell division, especially in the meristematic cells, we then have elongation and expansion, which then causes the shoots to grow. And the shoot, we're talking about kind of where that apical meristem is, where it's growing and producing. We also have similar meristematic cells located in the root tip, as we talked about on Monday. And that's just behind the root cap. Again, it's dividing, kind of growing up, as well as dividing going down into the soil. And in dicot trees, we also have kind of a secondary growth due to secondary xylem and the production of vascular cambium. So not only are we growing up, we're growing down, but we're also growing wider as well. In mature plants, once they've reached kind of gone beyond their period of juvenility, we actually get the vegetative apical meristems kind of switching the cells over. Remember, in the meristems, we have the undifferentiated cells. When it reaches that point, they can become reproductive cells and actually get a signal to switch, and it's usually a hormonal signal to tell the floral parts to form, and then the seed production after fertilization. So one of the big deals with this is that we're actually looking at growth and the rate of growth, how the different actual structural parts of the plant appear to us as genetic code, basically, and how the genes are and really the enzymes and proteins are transcribed. So all of this is we're looking at in terms of transcription factors, basically taking the DNA and putting it into play. So what signals this action of these regulatory genes? Really, the biggest thing that I want to share with you is that it is the hormones. And really, I think of hormones just like in people. We have hormones as we mature that trigger our different types of growth and development. Plants are the same, except we have different hormones. So where we have, estrogen, testosterone, they have auxin, gibberellins, cytokinins, and ethylene. And there are other hormones out there, but these are the main hormones that affect plant growth and development. They trigger plants to do different things. Auxins, for instance, trigger plants to develop roots. Gibberellins trigger plants to make more reproductive parts. Cytokinins, more shoot growth. Ethylene is more responsible for fruit and flower production and abscission as well. So each of these hormones trigger different things, and it's the balance of hormones, same as it is in people, that actually governs the growth of the different plant parts. Of course, environmental functions can signal these different developmental stages But what they're mostly doing is working to actually activate and deactivate that gene transcription, turn that DNA into what we see. Of course, we already talked about how important sunlight is in terms of the source of energy for photosynthesis. And we look at that photosynthetically active radiation, or PAR. It's also the same spectrum of visible light for human. And just remember that light is actually electromagnetic energy. It's really kind of fascinating. And it goes beyond that spectrum, of course. But 400 to 700 is what we see and what plants are actually able to perceive. And we'll talk a little bit about far red and red light here in a little bit. Another thing about sunlight, we're looking at the angle of incidence, which is basically the angle of the sun towards the Earth's surface. And generally a 90-degree angle of incidence, kind of perpendicular there, is where we have the maximum amount of light striking an area. And really we only have that angle of incidence in an open area during the summer solstice. Other than that, it's lower or higher than 90 degrees, and we don't have the maximum amount of sunlight reaching plant surface. And as that decreases or increases, then we get more light reflected rather than absorbed. So angle of incidence is actually really important. That changes throughout the seasons. And that's really important in terms of season extension especially. We have to try to make sure that we get the maximum amount of sunlight as possible. It's a major factor in governing the growth of plants. And we're looking at two major factors here with the angle of incidence and light itself. And I think of it kind of like a quality and quantity. Quality being the intensity and quantity being the amount. So intensity, the quality, directly affecting photosynthetic rates, and then the quantity, how much over the period of a day. And some plants actually react to that with some photomorphogenesis. And when they follow the sun, they track the sun, we call these heliotropic movements. Many plants actually do this, but kind of the main one that we look at is Helianthus annus, the sunflower. Of course, Helianthus, that genus name there, actually gets its name from its ability to keep not just the flowers, but also the leaves kind of facing the sun all day. They have that solar tracking, heliotropism. It's really pretty cool. So in terms of light quality, we're looking at the relative quantity of the individual component wavelengths in basically, one beam of light. And again, we've already mentioned this and talked about it, but photomorphogenesis is basically the response of plant growth and development to that quality of light. All right, so in this ratio here, and kind of skipped over a little bit there, some slides talking about red light and far red light. But think about it as kind of the light spectrum here. When light passes through a prism, you get the rainbow, right? That's our Roy G. Biv, the red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Green, of course, is reflected by the leaves of the plants, as we talked about on Monday. And the other colors are absorbed. So red and far red ratio is kind of what we're looking at in terms of light penetrating the leaf canopies, and actually has a great effect on the growth of plants. So think of red here kind of as on the visual spectrum, and then far red is kind of like more infrared light. Red light is efficiently absorbed, but far red light is transmitted or reflected. And as the red light is absorbed, by leaves on top of the canopy, the leaves below are receiving more of that far red light, which is not really good for the growth of plants. We want a higher red to far red ratio in order to have good plant growth. Generally, the way that most plants respond to this ratio is by increased height, reduced branching, and smaller stem diameters. And something I want to point out here is it's not really just increased height necessarily, but it's an increase in the internode length. And the internode, we're talking about the distance between each node. And a node is where a stem or leaf meets the meristem, the main stem. So generally, when we have higher far red light, then we get what we refer to as stretch. Plant is reaching for that light, so it has an increased internode length, which is really undesirable in a lot of crops, and as well as ornamentals. And we can kind of see it here in this example on these petunias. Which of those looks best to you? Anybody?
One on the right.
Yeah, the one on the right is kind of what we're looking for in terms of petunia production. We want kind of a bushy plant, and that has a filter on it. You can kind of see that filter in the background here that blocked out the far red light, but not the red light. So it's basically has a higher red to far red ratio. The plant in the center is normal sunlight. Doesn't look bad, but you can tell that it's got a little bit more stretch. The plant grown on the left has a filter that blocked the red light, but not the far red light. And you can see that it is taller, but the big thing here is the distance between nodes, that internode length, causing it to stretch, kind of be spindly, or as we might say in greenhouse production, kind of be leggy. And in many cases, that doesn't look good to people. So red and far red ratio is important. And where we might run into this is really just in canopy crops, our crop spacing. So we want to really try to space crops at the proper ratio to where we get that good far red to, or good red to far red, higher ratio. You've got a family of molecules involved in these photomorphogenic responses, and they're called cryptochromes. Basically, it's kind of governing that circadian rhythm, which the circadian rhythm we talk about really just the difference in night and day, and how not just plants but animals respond to those differences. It's actually really fascinating. They've done experiments where they put, for instance, like a lead shield in front of the plant, and yet it still responds to the circadian rhythms. It still has greater growth during the day instead of the night, even though it's not actually perceiving day or night. Fascinating. And that can be in a container plant or a plant growing in natural soil. Another big thing, and really what we see, the most visible photoperiodic response is starting to happen right now, especially over here in the higher elevations in the Appalachian Mountains. We see what we call autumn syndrome. We most often see that in woody plants, but it's basically the series of processes that prepare the plant for winter, pretty much, or dormancy, right? So dormancy, of course, is a temporary cessation of growth. Doesn't necessarily mean that there is absolutely no growth, although in many cases there are not. It just really depends on what the winters are like. But we can have root growth even though the above ground parts of the plants are dormant. This is induced, of course, by day length, and the shorter the days get, we start to see that more often. Just how the plant prepares for winter, how it makes itself ready to withstand winter in temperate climates. Obviously, we don't see this in the tropics. On the herbaceous perennial front, they have kind of a different deal. The woody plants, of course, they're able to, go dormant and make these, buds basically on the stem tips plants where they're able to hold on and, kind of produce dormantly. On the other hand, herbaceous perennials don't have that. Their above ground parts die to the ground. So the way they kind of respond to photoperiod is by the development of things like tubers or other organs and tissues that store energy. We say tubers here in the book, but we're looking at things like bulbs as well. Many different types of, in many cases, they're actually not technically roots, they're just underground stems. Of course, temperature is also a big player in the development of plants, obviously. We have to have particular temperatures for plants to grow. And all crops, all plants actually have optimal temperatures to maximize their vegetative growth and flowering. In our temperate regions, most of our native plants, they say here between 39 and 50 degrees, but really it's more like, between anything above freezing and up to, 80s, 90s. And that's where we get the general limits of plant growth. I think they might have had a typo in there. Of course, when we get into the upper 80s and 90s, we also have issues where we have too high of temperatures. Extremely high temperatures can destroy most cell protoplasm, which can result in damage to the crop or plant in any case. Of course, it depends on, think about where that crop came from. Think about its center of origin. Tomatoes, for instance. We actually, when we used to grow tomatoes as kind of a cash crop, we had hoop houses that were not, they didn't have any fans in them. That was actually part of a deal with the federal grant that we got. And they were meant for season extension. So we were unable to actually use electricity to have any environmental control. It's more for season extension. So what we had is we had tomatoes growing in these hoop houses where in the summer, when the highs are in the 80s and 90s, it got well above, 100 up to 120 plus degrees in the greenhouse. However, tomatoes, of course, are a tropical crop. So they were able to continue to grow, and these high temperatures were not causing major problems. So think about where your crops came from and try to emulate that kind of environment for it. Some things that we might have with high temperatures, we can have actual sunburn in plants. And usually that appears as kind of almost like white lesions, necrotic tissue to over-solarization. We can actually have heat damage even potentially at lower temperatures. We're still talking about 80s plus when we have relative humidity drops. Then we have dry, kind of desiccating winds that can damage plants as well. Opposite at lower temperatures, and the big thing that we're about to see here when we have our first frost is, the actual freezing and rupturing of cell membranes and walls, which allows that protoplasm and cytoplasm to flow out of the cells, desiccates the cells out, and causes them eventually to die and drop. So what we see in fall leaf color is basically we have to have some frost in order to initiate the death of chlorophyll, the revealing of the chloroplasts, in a brief period of time there, kind of in between a light frost and then a killing frost or freeze, where we actually see the dropping of leaves. For our crops, we can actually influence frost damage. We can, prevent or reduce frost damage to a certain extent by preventing radiant heat transfer from leaves of the plants to the cold sky. So some ways that people do that, when a frost is imminent, they might go out and actually water their plants. The water, contains that specific heat that prevents the radiant heat transfer. What's another way to do it? I'm sure you guys have probably done it in the early spring when we have early frost, or late frost, I should say. But also other times in the fall, we start to do it as well when we have early frost. How about just covering them up? You guys cover your plants ever? And actually, we used to do that when I worked doing landscaping. When we had early frost coming, we would do that to very sensitive vegetation like our Japanese maples, for instance. We would take out frost cloth, and when we ran out of frost cloth, often we would go out and grab like bed sheets and cover these crops. So keep that in mind. We can extend the season by preventing frost damage in many of our crops. Of course, on a large scale, that's not really practical. Also, we have low, kind of beyond freezing temperatures that can cue and coordinate different plant growth and development. And a couple of things we have here: stratification. That is a response for seeds to germinate. Especially with native plants, stratification, we're looking at a cool, moist period where the seeds are exposed to below freezing temperatures often, in order to prepare them and cause the embryos to develop inside of the seeds, or for the seed coat to be removed. We also have responses to flowering in terms of vernalization, and that's usually above freezing temperatures that we have vernalization for above ground plants. For below ground plants, it's below freezing temperatures. Vernalization triggers dormant plant parts to basically develop differently. For instance, in biennials, we have to have a vernalization period in order for them to be able to flower the next year. We'll also see dormancy breakage as a response to chilling requirements. And if anybody is interested in growing things like apples or other temperate fruits, we have a certain number of chilling hours that we have to receive in order for the plants to be able to break dormancy in the spring. Of course, we already mentioned how important water is to crops and to plants. A couple of things that I wanted to point out here. Water, of course, maintains the turgidity of plants, and that has to be through respiration and through transpiration. If the gases are not exchanged and the plant doesn't respire, then they will wilt due to underwatering or overwatering. So that's all about the turgidity of plants. That's the flow of water through the plants. There are some cases that we actually withhold water in order to keep plants from elongating in the stems, to keep them a little bit more bushy. And we often do that more in ornamental production, and they often, in those industries, call it drying down. Along with water, there are a couple of gases that are extremely important to the growth of green plants, including carbon dioxide and oxygen. And that actually triggers, in part, the stomatal opening. Those pores on the undersides of the leaves, the stomata, are opened and closed in response, in part, by those leaf CO2 levels. Oxygen is incredibly important in the respiration of all plants, both the uptake of nutrients in the roots, but also in the release of energy. And respiration is basically the release of energy that is captured and stored in sugars created during photosynthesis. That release of energy is what drives the biochemical reactions needed for both growth and development. And so really a big thing I want to point out is that respiration, again, is what kind of drives productivity in ecosystems. It's also what drives the growth and development of plants. It's not so much just the amount of sunlight, water, and nutrients. It's actually those being used and the gases being released that drives growth. The fluctuation of water in soil, and water through the plant is what drives growth. You could have everything be perfect, the perfect amount of water, the perfect amount of nutrients, but if the plant is not actually respiring and releasing that energy, it's not going to grow. 3 stages of seed germination. Kind of looking at different scale here. First, we have imbibition, which is when the seed begins to uptake water. Then we have an increase in biological activity on the inside, and usually we're looking at that as changes of enzymes. These enzymes are basically taking the energy that is stored inside of the seed and converting it into usable energy for the growing plant. And then we have the radicle, the first root, and the shoot actually emerge. And that's different for each plant, right? We have different germination periods. For beans pictured here, that's often fairly quick. We can see that in a matter of a few days. In some cases, it might be, weeks, months, or potentially over a year for germination to actually take place. And that's often referred to as like double dormancy when it takes over a year. They have several barriers for the seeds to be able to germinate. A little bit here about kind of the process. Germination begins with the seed imbibing the water that causes the cells to swell. The seeds increase a little bit in size as they go from that dry seed to uptaking water. And then there's actually a little bit of respiration and enzyme activity, taking those energy reserves, converting them into usable plant energy. And then we have the root and shoot appear. And then finally we have photosynthetic leaves appear. And then the new plant is able to produce its own energy. Generally, we are looking for vigorous vegetative growth in most plants. However, in the ornamental world, we might actually have a few exceptions to that. Like bonsai, for instance. We got any people interested in bonsai out there? A little bit. They're cool. Bonsai are interesting because we're actually not just pruning the above ground parts of these miniature trees, but also the roots. You notice they're always in shallow pots, and therefore we're trying to slow down growth in that case. And also in containerized ornamentals, we don't want them to grow beyond a certain point. We want them to stay flowering as long as possible. So we're looking at less vegetative growth, more floral production. And this is kind of where we're talking about the difference in vegetables and fruits. Vegetative growth, we're looking at the vegetative parts of the plant, not the reproductive parts of the plant. So in fruiting, we're looking at the reproductive structures. So the botanical difference there in vegetables and fruits. 4 principal functions of roots: anchoring, absorbing water and nutrients, then conducting that water and the dissolved minerals and allowing them to move into the xylem and phloem and throughout the plant. And in some cases, storing food materials in plants. Really, sweet potatoes, sugar beets, and carrots, these examples, we refer to them as root crops, but technically, botanically speaking, those are actually specialized stems and not roots themselves. However, the roots are transferring that energy to those stems. Of course, we use the rooting of plants in order to propagate them as well. And root systems and shoot systems tend to maintain a balance. It's not an even ratio, though. I mean, if you look at, say, a redwood, the tallest tree on planet Earth, there's one in particular, Hyperion, they named it. It's out there in a kind of coastal range in California, 379 feet tall. Do you think that means that the roots are 379 feet deep? There's no way. I mean, we might have that length, but they're not going to be growing directly down because they would be hitting bedrock and not able to grow. So There is a balance there, but it's not an even balance. But generally, as the top of the plant grows larger, the leaf area and water loss through transpiration is going to increase, and that is made up by increased water absorption through an increasing root system. Real quick, the difference in determinate and indeterminate growth. And all shoot growth is either determinate or indeterminate. And we've got examples here pictured, and we can talk about some more examples. The tomatoes on the left there, these cherry tomatoes being produced in a greenhouse, they have more of a vine type growth. It is indeterminate. They continually grow. However, not all tomatoes are like that, right? We have bush tomatoes, like a Roma tomato, for instance. It is determinate. It grows to a certain point and stops. Those determinate types are often more grown for and actually mechanically harvested on large-scale agriculture operations. The indeterminate types have to be more intensive because they continually grow. You have to provide a structure for that support, and they continually are harvested throughout the season. On the right here, we've got poinsettias, which are determinate. They, will grow to a certain extent, and as long as they have had those cues, the proper hormones, the proper photoperiod, they will then stop their growth pattern and switch to reproductive growth and initiate those floral bracts, and then stop growing, basically. And here's just kind of a chart looking at annual growth. And as I'm sure you guys already know, annuals are those crops that complete their life cycle in one growing season. We've got germination, we've got growth, vegetative growth, and then maturation, flowering, seed production, and then death, all in one growing season. Biennials, on the other hand, have 2 seasons, right? So here's kind of a typical angiosperm annual. Seeds planted, we have vegetative growth, we have flower initiation, we've got floral growth, we've got then flower emergence, flower opening, pollination happening, then fertilization, and then it gets into seed production, fruit and seed, I should say, that matures. That's kind of the end of the life cycle. And with plants, the goal of life, with most organisms, again, is to reproduce. So once a plant starts to get into fruit and seed production, it's going to start to senesce and begin to die. And that's why, for instance, in many of our crops, we continually are harvesting them. If we don't harvest them, like, for instance, a cucumber or a summer squash, for instance, if you allow that summer squash to continue to grow and get extremely large, and that's triggering, it's signaling to the plant, hey, I finished my life cycle, you can go ahead and die. But if we continually harvest them, then the plant has to restart, that reproductive cycle again, and of great benefit to us. As I mentioned, biennials require 2 growing seasons, but not necessarily 2 years always. You can get, actually, in some particular cases, we can have some environmental conditions that trigger biennials to flower in, even 1 growing season. But generally, we're saying 2 growing seasons to complete their life cycle. And here's an example of a biennial looking at a hollyhock. And almost all biennials have the same kind of growth pattern where they have what we call a basal rosette. And we're talking about a number of leaves kind of right at the ground and only producing at the base of the plant, hence the basal part. So they're really producing a fine root system, an extensive root system that first year, and a little bit of vegetative growth in order to obtain that energy. The second year, after they've gone through a dormant period and some vernalization, then they produce flower shoots. This is really important, especially for people that are interested in seed saving. the biennial crops you have to really plan for, because say things like beets, for instance, the first year they're just producing that root, and they have that basal rosette. They're pretty small. They don't take up a whole lot of space. The second year, when they produce these flower stalks, though, they can get, you know, up to like 6 feet tall. So you have to plan for that space. Most of our biennials, though, we're harvesting in the first season. Things like carrots. The stems, when they develop, it causes the roots to become woody. If we're eating them as a root crop, we don't want woody roots. Chilling temperatures that trigger the hormonal changes, including stem elongation, flowering, and then fruiting. And that's kind of where we start to get that whole idea of vernalization, triggering different hormonal changes. Perennials, of course, can be either herbaceous or woody, and they can survive for many different seasons. And it's different with each perennial in terms of how they reproduce. There are definitely perennials out there that are able to initiate floral production in the first year, but they remain alive for multiple years. They die back to the roots and then regrow. And that's due to adventitious buds at the crown of the plant. And if you have like spring flowering perennials, for instance, you can see those adventitious buds being formed now. For the fall blooming perennials that are blooming right now, we won't see those adventitious buds until the spring. If you start to see perennials kind of like flop over, that's a result of the crown of the plant continually growing out wider. So here's kind of that rhythm, that cycle for perennials pictured there in that graph. Of course, most of our crops are, you know, tropical or subtropical in origin, and in temperate areas, here, you know, we're growing plants, these tropical plants, even though they're perennials in their native climate, we're growing them as annuals. And that's, I mean, across the board with, you know, tomatoes, corn, potatoes, beans. I mean, many of our food crops are, now some of them are temperate annuals, like a lot of our grains. They're not tropical. They are never grown as perennials. So, except for in the case of the Land Institute, where they're trying to perennialize some of those grains. We look at woody perennial plants, those shoot and root systems. They say indefinitely, but of course they do have a, you know, lifespan. But that ultimate size for the particular plant is governed by both the genetic and the environmental aspect. And we will refer to that, and we'll talk about it more later on in class, the genotype and the phenotype. The genotype, we're referring to the DNA, the actual genetics of the plants. The phenotype is the environment and how the environment causes those genes to be displayed. And here we see some shoot growth of temperate zone plants annually and cumulatively through seasons. So throughout the year and then throughout the years. We also need to talk a little bit about juvenility and the maturing of plants. Again, just like people, you know, we change as we mature. And the morphology of juvenile and adult plants can be quite different. And they have this acacia here, where they have bipinnately compound leaves in the juvenile stage, but when they reach maturity, they have simple linear leaves. So huge difference in one plant right there could make it kind of difficult to identify. In identification of plants, we have to look at that difference in juvenility and maturity. And also how the environment affects that as well. So this graph we have just, or table has just differences in morphological characteristics in juvenility and adult stages. And I just want to point out here this, they have some kind of big words here. These in leaf shape, those are different leaf shapes, but here in growth habit, plagiotropic versus orthotropic, that's the difference in horizontal growth versus vertical growth. So, for instance, heterohelix English ivy, it's going to grow in its juvenile form, spreading around on the ground. Then when it reaches maturity, it's going to grow up. Here's just some phases of fruit and seed production. Again, we have to have the flowers induced, initiated, and then they differentiate and develop. They're pollinated, they're fertilized, and then fruits form and seeds form, and then they mature, and the fruits senesce, they fall off. And when the plant is mature, then we can actually switch from that vegetative to reproductive growth, which can be extremely important for us in crop production. Most of our agricultural crops are actually self-inductive. They initiate or form the flowers when they reach a certain part of morphological maturity. That could be in height of the plant, but often it's determined by how much heat it has received cumulatively. And we'll look at that in terms of growing degree days. That's a way that we actually try to predict the growth and harvest of crops. And that's actually something that weather services will actually record for us. And we're looking at growing degree days as the average increase in temperature above the base temperature. So some plants, for instance, witch hazel, which is one of the first plants to bloom naturally in our eastern forests, it only needs one growing degree day. So it can actually be blooming after it reaches dormancy, after leaves fall off, senesce. It has one day that's warmer than that average. It can initiate floral production. Here's just a picture of a chrysanthemum going to flower induction and initiation kind of from the primordial cells. Again, photoperiodism is important, the difference in night and day. And we mentioned it earlier, short day and long day plants that flower in response to those differences in daylight. For instance, some popular examples, chrysanthemums. Once we know what that photoperiod is that we need, or once we discovered that, we were able to influence that photoperiod. And in this case, they're talking about, you can kind of see it up there in the rafters of this greenhouse. They use blackout cloth to basically, prevent light, to change that photoperiod and get them to uniformly flower. Today, we can do it pretty much any day of the year. You can have flowering chrysanthemums. Another popular crop, poinsettias, same deal. We can produce them potentially year-round if we can govern that photoperiod. And poinsettias are kind of one of these, they initiate floral production at the equinox generally. So 12 hours of light, 12 hours of darkness. Same with the cannabis plants. We already mentioned vernalization. That's any cold temperature treatment that induces or promotes flowering. We see that in the biennials. We also see that in some winter annuals and some trees too. This slide, we're just looking at some of these low temperature induction of flowering signal and some particular plants such as bulbs, or in some cases, vernalization can occur in seeds. Again, the apical meristem is where these cells are differentiated, changes from vegetative to reproductive cells. And that's going to be dependent upon different species of plants and different cultivars. And we'll kind of end here on flower development. We'll talk more about other development, seed development, etc. Next week. But just want to point this out. The floral apex, where the apical meristem is, can abort if the environmental conditions do not favor full flower development. I'm sure you guys have probably seen this before. Flower buds dropping if temperature swings. So, and we can see that here in this poinsettia. It initiated that kind of bract production. We start to see some color, but then the flowers were aborted because the photo period was spoiled. All righty. So that covers the first part of Chapter 7. Anybody have any questions, comments, concerns? Don't forget to finish up the lab and also take the test by Friday. The test will close Friday at 11:59 p.m. So after that, you won't be able to take it. So get that test in. All right, you guys have a great day. We'll see you next week.
Okay, bye. Have fun.